Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into what's honestly one of the greatest historical detective stories of all time. We're looking at exactly how the modern world economic order came to be. So if you're looking to understand the deep, structural roots of global power, wealth, and trade, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to unpack a massive shift in human history, pulling directly from some really fascinating historical and economic data to show you how geography, war, and most importantly, global trade basically reshaped the entire planet.
Here's the central mystery we're trying to solve today. By the year 1800, Western European nations had conquered roughly 35% of the globe. They were monopolizing these incredibly lucrative trade routes as far away as Asia, and they were right on the brink of an industrial explosion. But why them? Why didn't the massive, highly advanced empires of Asia, like Qing China, Mughal India, or the Ottoman Empire, conquer the world instead?
Okay, let's dive into this. Historians and economists actually call this phenomenon the Great Divergence. Basically, it's that critical socioeconomic turning point where Western Europe, along with its settler colonies, broke through the constraints that had limited pre-modern economic growth for centuries. They completely eclipsed the great Eurasian civilizations that had previously been just as wealthy, if not wealthier. But to understand how this divergence actually happened, we first have to clear away some old misconceptions.
Which brings us to Section 1, Debunking Old Myths, Revisiting History. Now, it's super tempting to just think Europe won out because it invented free market capitalism and just had uniquely great institutions. But if you look at the 18th century, Europe was actually totally bogged down by anti-capitalist hurdles. We're talking strict apprenticeship laws, guilds, and in some places, actual serfdom. Meanwhile, core regions of China featured highly competitive markets, a really elaborate legal system of property rights, and wage rates that were surprisingly comparable to Europe's. So in many ways, China actually offered a freer marketplace than mercantilist Europe did.
Building on that, the data actually shows that China was absolutely not in some Malthusian crisis, where their population just heedlessly bred itself into starvation. The Chinese had cultural tendencies that controlled fertility just as effectively as those famous late marriage patterns in northwestern Europe. And living standards, they were basically equivalent. So, if domestic institutions, consumer markets, and demographics were roughly on par, the true engines of European dominance have to lie somewhere else entirely.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Gunpowder Tournament, Centuries of Conflict.
The numbers on this next point are just staggering. Between 1550 and 1600, the principal powers of Europe were at war 71% of the time. Europe was essentially one giant, unending military tournament. And why? Well, because the kings and princes of early modern Europe were constantly fighting for glory, territory, and commercial monopolies. But here is the real kicker. The rulers reaped all the rewards of victory, while the massive, crushing costs of these wars were passed heavily onto their subjects through taxation.
So the crucial point here is that Europe's intense political fragmentation created this really unique environment. Innovators and thinkers could easily just flee from one state to another, creating this pan-European integrated market for ideas. But more importantly, to just survive this constant interstate warfare, rulers were forced to funnel enormous amounts of tax revenue directly into military productivity. We're talking gunpowder technology, heavy artillery, and armed ships. Basically, sheer necessity bred incredibly rapid innovation.
That leads us to Section 3, Ships, Trade, and Tech, Commercial Expansion. But state militaries definitely aren't the whole story. The explosion of global commercial trade violently merged with this new technology, and it's perfectly captured by an astonishing figure, 17. Just let that number sink in for a second. This represents the massive multiplier of the European merchant fleet tonnage between the years 1500 and 1780. The total capacity of Europe's commercial shipping grew by a factor of 17. Maritime transportation literally became a leading sector of the world economy. During the Age of Sail, the transoceanic routes pioneered by the Spanish and Portuguese gave way to these incredibly aggressive chartered monopolies in the 17th century. Think of the Dutch and English East India companies. This huge boom in commercial maritime trade actually ended up driving technological innovation even faster than state navies did.
A perfect example of this is the cast iron cannon. Now, state navies were initially pretty reluctant to use cast iron because, well, it was heavy and prone to bursting. But for private merchant ships carrying valuable cargo across the globe, it was absolutely perfect. Cast iron was incredibly cheap compared to bronze, and this massive demand from private shipping caused industrial clusters to just completely boom in places like England and the Low Countries. European sailing vessels were effectively transformed into heavily armed mobile fortresses, giving them a massive protective and economic edge in global trade.
And this brilliantly illustrates a vital dynamic.
See, when these heavily armed European merchant ships arrived in Asian waters, large Asian states didn't just instantly submit. Nope. Instead, they made a highly rational economic choice. Why spend an absolute fortune trying to replicate complex European shipbuilding, cast iron foundries, and gunnery training when you can just hire European ships as mercenaries to fight your regional wars? It was basically cost-effective outsourcing. But in the long run, this meant Europe kept building highly specialized technological clusters, while Asian naval development totally stagnated.
Now for Section 4, Coal and the New World, Geographical Luck.
So we've got the military tournament and global trade. But the final major catalyst of the Great Divergence really just comes down to sheer dumb geographical luck. As the historian Kenneth Pomeranz argues, when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, geology is destiny. See, economic systems can only grow so much before they hit ecological bottlenecks, meaning they literally just run out of land for food, fuel, and raw materials. To break through that ceiling, you need an exogenous shock, like a massive external boost of resources.
It's wild how geography dealt its cards here. Coal was the energy source that made the Industrial Revolution possible, right? Well, England hit the geological jackpot. Its rich coal deposits were located almost exactly where manufacturers needed them, right next to efficient water transport. China, on the other hand, also had massive coal reserves, but they were largely trapped out in the thinly populated northwest, hundreds of miles away from the manufacturing hubs down in the south and east. So in China, coal remained a stranded asset, while in England, it quite literally fueled a revolution.
The second massive stroke of geographic luck was Europe's access to the Americas. The colonization and exploitation of the New World provided Europe with what economists call ghost acreage. The huge influx of cotton, sugar, and timber from the Americas saved England from needing to cultivate an estimated 23 to 25 million additional acres of land back at home. It freed up land and labor in Europe for industrialization, while simultaneously providing a huge captive global market to buy those newly manufactured European goods. Literally no Asian empire had an advantage even remotely comparable to this.
Finally, Section 5, The Legacy of Divergence, Shaping the Modern World. Let's bring all this historical data into focus by looking at its lasting impacts. How exactly did the Great Divergence shape the modern world economy we live in today? Well, as Europe's economic and military might compounded, it locked in its advantage through imperialism. European powers set up periphery countries to be specialized producers of raw materials. Then, using their control, they prevented those colonies from industrializing themselves. A really tragic example of this is the deindustrialization of India. Once the absolute leading cotton supplier in the world, India saw its domestic textile industry systematically undermined by British policies. Britain imported raw Indian cotton, used the Industrial Revolution to manufacture textiles dirt cheap, and then flooded the captive Indian market with British goods. This dynamic quite literally structured modern global inequality.
So as you can see, European dominance wasn't the result of some inherent cultural superiority or uniquely perfect institutions. Instead, it was forged in the fires of a brutal gunpowder tournament, accelerated by a massive expansion of global maritime trade, and ultimately secured by the incredible random luck of coal deposits and New World resources. Which leaves us with a pretty critical question to ponder. If the Great Divergence in Western economic dominance were largely driven by historical contingencies, geographic luck, and outsourced naval services, is the current global economic order permanent, or are we already watching the foundations of the next great shift? Think about that for a bit. And hey, thanks for joining me for this explainer.